Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Elizabeth on the Storytelling with Data team, and welcome to today's installment of our next DataViz Makeover series. I can see everyone is starting to join. Hi, Rodrigo. Welcome. We like this already, too. So we have a great case study to share with you here today. But before we get there, though, let me actually just back up and tell you a little bit about our makeover process. So at Storytelling with Data, our goal is to help people and organizations create graphs that make sense and weave them into compelling data stories that drive action. Now, we do this through a number of resources: our books, our blog, our YouTube channel here, our podcast, our community. But most of our time is spent teaching workshops to organizations around the world. And during these workshops, we ask participants to share with us examples of data that they work with in their daily roles, and we'll illustrate how to be more effective at communicating with data through the concepts that we teach. So in today's session, I'm going to be giving you a peek of that process through the lens of a real business example, which looks like this. So this actually is a real business example. Now, the details have been slightly modified to protect the original scenario, but what you see here really mimics the spirit of the original that we started with. I'm also joined here today by my colleague and fellow data storyteller, Alex. Welcome, Alex. I'm so happy to have you with me, as well as all of the folks who are tuning in live.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Happy to be here. And I'm monitoring the chat window today and just curious, what do folks think about this example? See, somebody mentions Germany colors, so maybe eliciting some fun feelings there if you have a personal tie. But what other thoughts do you have about this example? And I should simply mention that we circulated this graph on social media earlier this week. So I've already seen a number of thoughts and ideas for how to improve this graph. Going to quickly recap some of those thoughts with all of you. So one of the first comments I saw was from Lucia, which was about subsetting the amount of information. And I think this is an important thought because there is a lot of information here. And actually, one thing you don't know is that there could be even more information. In fact, we're looking at 19 warehouses, but the full data set included 66. Imagine if the original creator decided to include all 66 bars. That would be incredibly overwhelming here. But instead, they did us a favor. They narrowed things down to 19 bars. And so Lucia thought, well, what if we could expand on this? What if we also only showed some of the rates? Maybe we only showed accuracy rate and null rate, or error rate and null rate. That could open up different ways to visualize this data. I'm also seeing some comments come through in the chat window here. So Rick mentions it's feeling overly busy. And one way that we could control that is by stripping away some of that data, as Lucia mentioned. Rebecca mentions, I don't know, is this good? Is this bad? So craving a little bit more context here. And a lot of comments about color. Elizabeth, I know you've thought about the colors here. Do you want to share some thoughts you have?
Well, I will say that when I first saw this graph, it made me feel bad. And the reason for that is because most of the graph is red, which in Western cultures, red to us means bad, right? Danger, pay attention, stop, stop signs. So that's my immediate reaction. But then when you actually start to look at the graph a little bit more, you realize maybe red isn't necessarily a bad thing here. It's encoding accuracy rates, which actually seems like a good thing. Or perhaps red is the brand color or the template that we were required to use. And so I should also mention we're looking at this particular example out of whatever original context it was a part of, right? So we're not really privy to some of the decisions that were made. So we'll be making sure that we are talking thoughtfully about somebody else's work, but also just making some assumptions as we need to for the purposes of our discussion here. So I can see there's some other comments come in. A lot of people just have questions about, is this good? Is this bad? What are we supposed to do with this graph? So we can all agree that there's some room for improvement, right, Alex? Should we just go ahead and jump right in?
Yeah, absolutely. Some other thoughts are coming in about maybe using a heat map, so a table if we want to show more precise values. There's a recommendation to group things by region because we don't know where these warehouses are located. But I'm with you. I want to see how you would approach this graph.
All right. So before I actually start remaking it, let's talk about the different considerations and components for effectively communicating with data. Now, there's a lot of things to consider when we communicate in a business setting with data. Here are just five, right? There's the context, which you can think about. That's our audience. Why are we communicating in the first place? There's the graph that we use. And I'm using graph here, but it really could be a choice of visuals. So perhaps it's just text or images, right? And then it's not just the graph, but it's how we design the graph. So it's the amount of clutter that our tools, unfortunately, just put there for us. And we don't always think about why is this there? It's also how we choose to focus our audience's attention and how we combine graphs with other context into an overarching story. So these are just some of the considerations we want to be thoughtful of when we are more effective at communicating with data. So I'm not going to go into these in great detail today, but we have a ton of resources we can share both in the chat window and in the description and the comments down below if you want to learn more about specific things. And as you're watching live, as I go through this remake, definitely be sharing with us what questions you have. What is your reaction to the different illustrations here? So let me actually back up and talk first about the context and give you a sense of what the underlying scenario was. So go ahead and give this a quick scan. All right, so this case study came from a national retailer that was measuring why customers had been returning their orders at a higher volume than usual. So the team was tasked with investigating where is this actually happening and reporting back to the VP of fulfillment. And this is the slide that they sent back to talk about where we're doing well and where we're not doing so well. Right. So we can assume that our VP of fulfillment probably had the same reaction and questions that all of us did. So the first thing I'll recommend when we think about, well, how do we make this more effective is let's talk first about the graph type and think about, is this an effective way to visualize the data? Now, one way to determine if your chosen visual makes sense is to try graphing it several different ways and evaluate what each graph type allows you to see or not particularly easily see. So I'm going to step out of this chart for just a second and show you the underlying data in a table. So that looks like this. So along the left-hand side, we can see our warehouse ID. That's the numeric values that we see. And then we have a couple columns of data. We've got the total number of orders that were fulfilled, the accuracy rate, the error rate, and how that sums to the percentage of total. And so one thing I'll just point out here with this table is notice the process that you're going through, right? You are reading it. You're looking down line by line. You're looking for particularly interesting values. You're trying to compare those to other interesting values. And so just recognize that anytime you give your audiences tables, they will be reading them, right? And so you want to be thinking about, if I'm going to do that, is that what I want my audience to do? Right? Do they need to have a specific level of detail or perhaps look up numeric values, right? Do I need to scan down and look for warehouse ID 12 and know exactly that it's 372 compared to 85, so forth and so on? I'll also point out how much harder your task is when I'm talking to you at the same time. So we just want to be aware of how much of that reading we're asking our audiences to do in a live setting like we are here today. Now, there's obviously things we can do to alleviate some of that visual scanning. So I'm seeing conditional formatting, heat mapping, things we can do to make our tables easier to process. We can also think about going back to a graph, right? So I'm just going to switch this from a table to a line graph. I think somebody voted earlier we could try a line graph. So here's what that actually looks like. I'm actually just going to pause and see, do lines make sense here? Share with me your thoughts. Is this an effective graph? What do you think, Alex? Does a line chart work?
I don't think so here. And I think it's because we have categorical data where I'm finding myself competing with my own brain. I want to trace the trend of this line, which doesn't make sense because I really want to focus on the rate within an individual ID and then compare that to others. And others are saying something similar, right? No, a line chart does not work. Time series, a line chart could work well, but here we have categorical data. So I think we have a solid consensus here.
Right. And this is the danger of leaving it up to our tool to choose our visual for us. Because if we take a look at the horizontal x-axis, it actually looks like continuous data, time series data. But this is in fact categorical because these represent the warehouse IDs. Right? So we just need to be aware of how we graph our data and does it actually make sense just because my tool gives me hundreds of different visual choices, right? So I'm in agreement with everyone here that this is a line chart is not particularly an effective way. So let's actually go back to the way we originally had it graphed, which is 100% stacked bars. And so one choice I would recommend making here is actually flipping from a vertical orientation to horizontal. Now, the reason I would do this is let's assume instead of numeric warehouse IDs, I have very long category names. So perhaps there's a long alphanumeric category, or maybe we want to spell out the name of the warehouse, which you can imagine can get very long. A horizontal orientation would allow me extra space along the left-hand side to actually spell things out horizontally, and I wouldn't have to diagonally rotate or truncate my text. So I'm going to land here on my choice of graph. I think this is going to be a more effective choice to eventually tell that story. But before I go further, I want to just pause and ask you all to share with me what other changes could we make at this point. So we've chosen the visual. What else would you like to change about this graph?
So there are some votes for subsetting the data further. Instead
Okay.
of showing 19 warehouses here, maybe we could show something that's a little more even, like top 10, top 5, if we needed to. And I want to just remind everyone that we are already subsetting the data. The full data set itself is 66 warehouses. So the original creator did us a favor by truncating that down so that our eyes weren't drawn everywhere all at once. Some
But
more,
that does bring up a good point. Why 19, right? So the original creator of the graph has done nothing to specify what's important about these particular 19 warehouses. So we have some room for improvement in terms of, is it the top 10? Should it really be 20? Like, why are we only showing 19? That's great feedback as well.
Absolutely. Other comments coming in, color with an exclamation point. So folks really want you to play with the color. Also, some sort of ordering needs to be done here. Something intentional beyond just the numerical order that we see here. Grouping by the highest rates or not, grouping by region. There's got to be something that we can do to give our audience a way to categorize all of this data and more easily process it.
All right, so let's give the folks what they want. So they want me to remove the color. We can definitely do that. We could also make some other changes in terms of just adding more structure to this graph. And so I'm going to make a lot of what I consider decluttering changes in the next iteration that I'm going to show. That looks like this. So let me actually step through all of the changes that I made when I switched to this new view here. So removing color, and we're going to add that back in eventually. So I wouldn't just, lead with a de-emphasized all gray graph like we have here. Took away all of those grid lines. We had a lot of votes for that. I also improved the chart title. So now it is clear that we're looking at the accuracy rates for the highest volume warehouses. So again, not really sure why that cuts off at 19, but a little bit more context why we had compared to the original. Then I could use that footnote down at the bottom to go into further detail about where the data source came from, or where the data came from. And if you want more information on the remaining warehouses, where to actually find it. So not leaving it up to my audience to guess about why we're only showing a subset of data. I've also explicitly labeled my X and my Y axis. So along the Y axis, I'm showing that this is the warehouse ID number. Along the x-axis, labeling that this is the total orders fulfilled, a percentage, and then that this is broken down by accuracy, error, and null rates. So moving that legend to the top compared to where it was over there hanging out awkwardly on the right-hand side. So because now I have a little bit more space on the right-hand side, I could pull in some additional context if I needed to, right? If I thought my VP of film was going to ask me, well, what's the total volume, right? So you're only showing percentages here. Maybe she also wants to get a sense of what is that volume. I could provide that there with that extra space. Or if that's not necessarily an important detail to my audience, I don't want to just fill up white space just because it's there, right? We can be more strategic about where we place things on the page. So another way I can add some structure is think about sorting the data differently. I've seen a lot of comments and requests for that. So currently it's sorted numerically by the warehouse ID. That might that might make sense if we were back in that like look up specific values scenario, but I want to sort in a more meaningful way. So I'm going to do two things in my next change. I'm going to sort in a descending order by accuracy rates. And I'm also going to add some additional context and pull in what the overall average is for all of the warehouses that I'm not showing, just to provide that. So that looks like this. So from a decluttering standpoint, everything has been taken away that was distracting or not particularly helping get my main message across. So I'm left with a more effective graph from a decluttering perspective, right? But I don't want to just stop here. So now I want to think about, well, what's going to be interesting to my VP of fulfillment in terms of what do we do with this data, right? And I can use color and words to make that clear. So perhaps I first want to call attention to overall our accuracy rates. I could highlight that in blue, de-emphasize the rest of the graph. So now we can see accuracy rates are generally between 80 and 90% for our top volume warehouses, which seems pretty good. It seems like a good thing. But maybe I want to get a little more specific though. Maybe I want to emphasize that overall average and talk about the ones that are above average and why they're above, maybe perhaps the ones who are below average and where we have some room for improvement. Speaking of room for improvement, maybe the conversation really needs to be on these error rates, right? So I could use a different color, orange here, to signal, hey, this is the opportunity, right? It's not necessarily all good. We need to still be talking about why our high volume warehouses have these error rates. So these are just several examples of different ways that I could use color to help focus attention on the different plot points when I think about putting together that overall story. Before we get there though, I want to just pause and see, Alex, what are folks saying on chat about what we've gone through so far?
Well, the first comment I see is this looks better. So certainly taking the time to format your visuals goes a long way, not just relying on the default settings that come out of your tool, but using color intentionally, being thoughtful about the order of the warehouses as well as the categories themselves. So some other ideas that folks wanted to see were a reordering of the categories. So maybe moving the null section to the middle, and that way you could easily compare the accuracy rate on the left-hand side of the graph as well as on the right-hand side of the graph. There's also some debate about the metric that's being shown. So this combination of showing the proportions and the absolute values. And I know you shared one view to show both of that, but we can really only visualize one of those metrics at once given the graph type that we have. So one of those, the total volume, is going to be more of a supporting point, and we could do that by listing it numerically off to the right-hand side of the chart. A lot of folks are enjoying the view that you shared, and I think we're eager to see, how would you take this home? How would you tell a full story with this data?
Awesome. And we should also mention, if you're not watching live, if you're watching the replay, tell us what you think in the comments as well. Maybe if you have questions about anything that you've seen so far, we'll go back and answer those questions after the fact. So when it comes to actually telling a story, we want to think about, well, how will I be delivering that? Right? So typically in a business setting, we communicate in one of two ways, either at a live presentation or we're asked to send things around that have to stand on their own. So ideally, we want to differentiate between those two methods of communicating because they call for completely different materials. So I want to illustrate first what my materials would look like in a live meeting. So let's assume our VP of Fulfillment has said, Elizabeth, can you provide an update at our next staff meeting about what you found? So I might put together a presentation that looks and sounds like this. So today I'd like to talk about what we found with our overall accuracy rates and talk about some room for improvement when it comes to our error rates. So just to give you a sense of context, overall we have an 85% accuracy rate, and that's across all of the warehouses across the United States. So that seems like a pretty good thing, right? 85% accuracy is, close to the target that we shoot for. But when you really start to break this down, that means that there's an opportunity to improve quality because we have a 10% error rate as well. Now, to talk about and prioritize our resources, I want to focus on a specific subset of our warehouses and only look at the highest volume warehouses. And that's what we'll be looking at here, because we think we have an opportunity in the near term from a quick hit standpoint to only focus on the ones that we'll be showing in this graph. So what you're going to be seeing is the percent of total orders fulfilled. That's what's along the x-axis, and that's going to be ranging from 0 to 100%. And I'll be breaking that down between our accuracy rates, our error rates. We do unfortunately have some data quality issues. So some of these are going to be null. It's not a ton, but that is going to be shown there as well. Along our vertical y-axis, I'm going to be showing the warehouse IDs for our top volume warehouses. So there's going to be 19 of those. And then I'll pull in the overall average just to get a sense of what that looks like. So what you can see is that 85% accuracy rate and that 10% error rate that I mentioned a little bit ago. So when we look at the spread, 12 of our top volume warehouses are at or above this average. So that brings me to our first recommendation of the day. We need to really deep dive what is working well in these particular warehouses and figure out, are these things that can be applied broadly across the US? Because when it comes to the opportunity, when improving our error rates, you can see that there are some that are above this 10% average. And again, this is our highest volume warehouses. So this is where we think we have the most opportunity. So 3 of those regionally are in our West region, and 6 of these are in our Northeast. So we actually recommend starting here in the Northeast and specifically scheduling meetings with the points of contact to put action plans in place and learn from the warehouses that are doing well in terms of what can be applied in this particular region. So in my live presentation, I could walk through this graph in the manner in which you just saw. Now, if I were not presenting live, maybe I would just have one single summary slide that could provide all of that detail that I just went through in the live presentation. So just illustrating how when we give live presentations compared to slides that need to stand on their own, they should look and sound very different, right? So this slide I would not use in my live presentation because it has entirely too much text. And it's a difficult experience for my audience to have to read all this text and try to listen to me at the same time. So this is an example of a standalone slide. So regardless of how I'm actually sharing that back to my VP of Fulfillment, just check out the difference from where we started, right? Believe it or not, it's actually the exact same data between the before and the after, but just a couple changes took it from just simply showing data to weaving data into an effective story that actually could drive action and hopefully change. So let's see, Alex, what are people saying as far as some of the changes that they went through? And I should mention, this is a great place to pause and just ask for questions as well.
Yeah, so let's give folks a moment to just digest all that you have shared. And I think you ended here with a really important point. And it's striking when you look at the before and the after. The difference is the view on the left, it's just data. We're leading with our numbers. But for the view on the right, we're instead leading with story, leading with the so what, the narrative, and then using our data, our graphs, to reinforce the main points that we're trying to get across. And it's that combination of story and data that drives such a deeper understanding. Now, one question that I see on my end is just they're asking you to go more into this idea of differentiating between what you share when you're presenting live versus what you send around if somebody's going to consume it independently. And so folks are always asked, well, I have to share my presentation deck, right? My audience is asking for my slides. So creating two completely different materials feels like a lot of work. Do you have any tips for when you don't have time to do so?
Yes, because that's very common, right? Ideally, in a perfect world, we would have unlimited time to create two completely different work products, but time constraints, particularly in business settings, are very real. So, something that I used to do in prior roles was actually design my single fully annotated slide that would be the standalone version. So, that's what you see here as the after image. And then if I didn't have any time or limited time to go through and make, the different slides versions that I would use for the live presentation, I'd use white text boxes to cover up different parts of the slide so that it still gave me an ability to control how much data my audiences were seeing in live presentations, that it could still function as the send around, particularly if you put this slide at the very beginning of the deck. So it's the first thing your audience would see if they're reading on its own, and they wouldn't have to click through and try to figure out why things are appearing and disappearing without you there, because that's the purpose of you, the narrator. So that's a quick hack to try to save yourself some time when you don't. And also
Also,
see there's a question about, or there was a comment, this might have come up earlier, about should we just remove the null category from this data as well? And I think, when it comes to how much data do we show, do we remove things? I think you just want to be thoughtful around, how familiar is your audience with this data? And if we took away that null category, does that mean that would likely ignite some questions about, well, this doesn't sum to 100%. So where's the rest of the data? Right. So I think, for me, when I was redesigning this, I left it there because I can think back to a lot of business meetings where I would remove things because I thought it made sense and I was trying to simplify, and then only have somebody derail the conversation by saying, well, this isn't right. Like, where's the missing data? And then you start to lose a little bit of that credibility. So I think if it's completely distracting and you have talked yourself out of the situation where your audience, is not going to ask you those, or it's not going to be necessary, then you probably could. You would just want to document at some point in your deliverable that, where that remaining data is, particularly when you're dealing with percentages that don't sum to 100%. So just being aware of your audience and their familiarity and their needs as well.
absolutely. There's no right or wrong. There's so many ways to communicate effectively with data. So it's about finding one of those ways that's going to be effective for your given scenario. So to be respectful of time, I think you've given folks a lot to think about here, Elizabeth, today. If people want to see more makeovers or practice employing some of these techniques that you've talked, where can they go? Do you have any resources you'd recommend?
Yes, absolutely. So the first resource I'll point you to is our community, which you can find on our website, community.storytellingwithdata.com. We'll share this link both in the chat window as well as the description down below. And specifically within the community, I'll point you to a couple of our free exercises in our exercise bank related to things that you saw here today. So we have an exercise around the importance of color and words and how do you tie those two things to a graph effectively. There's one around, well, which graph would you choose? Because as we talked about, there is no single right answer when it comes to what's the right graph. And sometimes it takes creating several different versions to identify which one's going to be an effective. And then something that I really didn't talk much about at all is, I didn't just sit down at my computer and plan out that progression of slides and it just fell out that way. But rather, I used a storyboarding process. And there's an exercise you can do to go through a similar process of putting together an effective live presentation. So these are just a couple resources I'll point you to that are specific to things that you saw here today. Another one I'll point you to if you want to learn a lot more about the entire storytelling with data process that we talked about is we have a number of upcoming workshops for individuals to participate in. So the next one is going to be on May 4th and 5th. This one is going to be our foundational. It's a 4-hour virtual workshop, so you can join from anywhere in the world, from the comfort of your own computer, and spend time with us on the Storytelling with Data team, really deep diving those 5 different components of effective storytelling that I talked about. You can find more information about this also on our website on our public workshops page. The next level workshop that we're doing is a little bit more immersive. So this is going to be a follow-up practice session where you have the opportunity to bring a project that you're working on, and we'll actually walk you through a series of exercises to help you make sure that you're clear and you have a goal for what that overall presentation is. So that's also going to be coming up in May. So if you're watching this video and it is after May 12th and you're thinking, gosh, I missed these, I'd love to come to another one, make sure you follow our public workshops page because we do these on a quarterly basis. So we hope to catch you the next time. So thanks for tuning in today. Make sure to follow our page not to miss our next installment of our DataViz Makeover series. You all have been a great audience. I like interacting with you and hearing your thoughts, your comments. So I'm Elizabeth Ricks, and on behalf of Alex and myself, we wish you great success in communicating with your data.